The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello and good afternoon and good morning to some of you. Thank you so much for joining us for our second Careers in Student Affairs Month webinar. Today we have President of NASPA, Dr. Kevin Kruger, and our NASPA Board Chair, Dr. Penny Rue, who will be talking to us today about the current state of student affairs. Before I introduce our two presenters and get us started, I am just going to do a little bit of housekeeping with all of our attendees. So on your screens, you all should have your excuse me, you all should have a sidebar from GoToWebinar. In that sidebar, you can ask questions, and there's also a chat feature. You can use the chat feature to connect with one another and discuss everything that is going on. And we encourage you to put questions into the questions tab. My name is Colleen Daugherty, and I am the Recruitment Engagement and Volunteerism Coordinator with NASPA, and I will be moderating those questions today. So if anyone has any questions both about the content of today's webinar or for me about NASPA in general, you can put those into the questions tab and we will make sure that they get answered. So to get us started, today we have Dr. Kevin Kruger. Dr. Kruger draws on more than 35 years of experience in higher education. Since 2012, he has served as President and CEO for NASPA, Student Affairs Administrators in Higher Education. Prior to his role as president, Dr. Kruger worked for 18 years as the Associate Executive Director and served as the Chief Operating Officer and Chief Financial Officer for NASPA. He has held a range of student affairs positions at Southern Methodist University and the University of Maryland. As NASPA president, Dr. Kruger represents student affairs at a variety of national forums and is a frequent contributor to higher education news stories on the college student experience. Dr. Kruger has published and presented nationally on trends in higher education, student success, degree completion strategies for low-income and first-generation students, technology and change management and leadership in higher education. He is the proud father of two children, one a college junior and the other a senior in high school. Dr. Kruger received his master's and PhD in counseling and personnel services from the University of Maryland. And we also have with us today Dr. Penny Rue. Penny Rue joined Wake Forest University as Vice President for Campus Life and Professor of Counseling in July of 2013. She serves as Vice President for Campus Life with a broad responsibility for the well-being and safety of Wake Forest students and their commitment outside of the classroom. Dr. Rue has served as Vice Counselor for Student Affairs at the University of California, San Diego for 6 years. She is nationally known for her creative leadership in strengthening campus communities. She served for 5 years as Senior Associate Dean of Students at Georgetown University and for 7 years as Georgetown's Director of Student Programs. Earlier in her career, she held posts at the University of Maryland and the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. Dr. Rue has a doctorate degree in counseling and personnel services from the University of Maryland, where her dissertation research focused on a conceptual study of community on the college campus. Dr. Penny Rue has taught the capstone class in the San Diego State University Master's Program in Student Affairs and College Student Development in the Higher Education Doctoral Program, and as well as in the Higher Education Doctoral Program at the University of Virginia. She holds a master's degree in Student Personnel Services from the Ohio State University, from which she received the Maud Stewart Outstanding Alumna Award in 2011. And an AB Magna Cum Laude in English and Religion from Duke University. In 2011, she was named a Pillar of the Profession by the NASPA Foundation. She is currently the Public Policy Division Chair. She is currently the chair of the NASPA board. At Wake Forest University, Dr. Rue supervises several departments, including Residence Life and Housing, Office of the Dean of Students, Wellbeing, Campus Recreation, Student Health Services, and the Office of the Chaplain and University Police. And without further ado, I turn it over to the two of them.
Thanks, Colleen. It's a real pleasure to be here today as one of the parts of Careers in Student Affairs Month. This is a really exciting month for folks who are thinking about student affairs as a professional career, and I'm just thrilled that I get to spend next hour talking with you and my dear friend and board chair, Penny Rue. I'm going to tell you a quick anecdote. While Penny and I work together very closely in my role, so my role is as the president and CEO, I'm the full-time staff member who provides leadership to NASPA, and Penny is the chair of the board of directors, so provides leadership to the board and board initiatives. So we get to work obviously very closely together. Technically, Penny's my boss, but she's a really easy boss, actually. She's a nice boss. But the story I want to say is, which is kind of relevant for this conversation for many of you, and that is, while Penny and I are sitting here together in this chair, we first met in 1982. So it's been a long time. We've known each other a long time. We both worked together at the University of Maryland, and worked for a great boss who was a mentor to both of us. We both went through the Maryland PhD program together, suffered through everything from advanced statistics classes to capstone seminars with the Vice President of Student Affairs. So it's a pleasure. It's one of those things that I want to share as a starting place. For many of you who are thinking about higher education as a career, it's not just, a career in your first job. It really is a lifelong kind of really a life of relationships that you build one at a time and in groups over the course of your entire career. And I think that Penny and I are not unusual in having these sort of kind of life-spanning relationships that have been so meaningful. So, what we're going to do is tick through a couple of kind of issues. We're going to try to make this informal. Penny and I are going to chat a little bit about some of these things. But as many of you in the audience are sort of thinking about getting into student affairs, I thought it might be interesting for both of us to share a little bit of an anecdote about our trajectory about how we got into this field in the first place. Sort of we joke about this, that very few people start off, as high school, freshmen and think, oh, what I want to do is I want to be a dean of students at a college university. It's something you discover along the way, and everybody has their own tale. So Penny, could you just give us a little bit of a start and tell us how it is that you got into this in the first place?
I feel very lucky, first of all, to have been led into this incredibly rewarding career. But like many of you probably, I was very lucky to have been mentored by my dean of students. And I was an orientation leader on my campus. We didn't have undergraduate RAs, so that wasn't an option. But as an orientation leader, I actually lived on the floor with the people that I was the group leader for. And I just loved it. And that role allowed me to meet these people who did the bigger roles on campus, and to learn and find out that this was actually a field. It was actually a career services professional who said to me, you might want to think about student affairs. And I hadn't thought of it as a field, even knowing these wonderful people that worked with me.
Right.
And so I went straight into a master's program from undergraduate school, which has made it a pretty easy pathway for me. I went to Ohio State, which had a big, well-funded program. I got a funded master's degree and came out with specific experiences in residence life and academic advising and career counseling, and all of those threads have woven together throughout my career.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned something, I think, that as you all are thinking about this and thinking about grad school in particular, you mentioned Ohio State, which has a long history of not only providing kind of support for the academic work, but you had an assistantship.
Right.
And so this notion of having an assistantship is really key to our field in a lot of ways, because you can't just read about it. It's an applied profession. And so one of the things you all might want to think about is as you're looking at graduate programs, is looking for opportunities that link the practice and the profession.
Right.
Say a little bit about what was your first assistantship?
Yeah, my first assistantship was as a live-in residence life professional, very typical. That was also my first full-time job, I might add. So the great thing about that is I got supervision experience of supervising my RA staff at a very young age. And supervision experience is one of those steps you need to get to the next step typically. So that was really, really valuable for me.
Yeah. So our trajectory is not dissimilar. Yeah. I was an orientation advisor in college. But I wasn't RA. I had no idea. I think that, like the folks even on this, we didn't have careers in student affairs.
Right.
We didn't have the sort of opportunities to learn about the field. I learned about it really almost upon graduation or last semester graduation, when I realized I didn't want to be a social studies teacher, And I had a hall director, and I said, well, how do you get to do this?
Yeah,
And I had
yeah.
no idea really at that point.
It was a thing.
It was a thing, you know. So, so one observation I'd have is I think, you know, you and I are kind of emblematic of this transition to student affairs from in the early part of the, you know, our careers when it largely came about through being a student leader, you know, with orientation or res life or RA, that kind of thing. You know, kind of fast forward a little bit, you know, you supervise a lot of young professionals, or at least you supervise people who supervise them. Do you see there's any difference in how younger professionals now are coming into the field that is different than when we came up? Do you think there's an evolution?
I think there is an evolution. Some things are the same. You know, you want folks that have empathy and compassion. You talk about the linking theory and practice. The theory part matters too.
Sure.
You actually have to study the field to be able to practice it well. So we want folks that are committed to knowing the foundational work of the field. But today's young professional students are so much more sophisticated than we were. I mean, if they have RA training in suicide prevention, for example, that's not anything that we thought about or looked at back then. Also, just they know so much more about the world, frankly, because of the internet. I mean, it's funny for you all to think about the fact that I went all the way through my doctoral program with no internet. So think about what research was like then.
I think we both had the same experience. We both, you did quantitative or did you qualitative?
I did quantitative.
Yeah, me too. I did quantitative research for my PhD, and I still remember carrying a box of punch cards from my data to the computer science center to have them run, and worrying that I would trip
and fall.
And then they'd be all out of order, that kind of thing, which is something that really is only something we now can joke about. It's not a common experience.
And every hole in that card was punched by a button that we pushed.
That's right, exactly.
Yeah, a little bit different.
So, you know, as was indicated, you're in your, is this the third vice presidency you've had?
My second vice presidency. I was also dean of students at UVA. So 3 senior students.
So, but you've been in a senior student affairs role for now, how many years now?
Yeah, since '99.
Yeah, a long time. Yeah. Did you always think that you wanted to be a vice president? Was that the career objective from the get-go, or did it kind of come about?
I never had a grand plan. I never looked beyond the position I was in. I've loved every job I've had. I still think I could be director of student programs and be happy doing that. Yeah. But what I sort of found is that when I was ready, the next thing appeared. I was really lucky about that. And you get to a certain level. Once I got to UVA, then search firms start being interested in you, and you get on that kind of a list. And it's nice to, this is a long time off for you all, but it's nice to work with a search firm because they're representing both you and the institution in the process. But I think our search processes have gotten a lot more sophisticated too.
One more thing on sort of our backgrounds. So we both got our PhD at Maryland, of course. Now as you sort of think about the field and you think about the need, the need for advanced, so you all are basically just getting ready to start a master's, I think, for most of you in this audience. So it seems a little premature to sort of say, well, now you'll be able to get a PhD. But what do you think the current thinking is about advancing in the field, with additional education and with a PhD or an EDD?
The advice that I give younger professionals who ask me this question is really if you want to be a faculty member, if you know that's your goal, then getting through a master's to a doctorate as directly as you can makes sense. If you know you want to be a researcher, and some people do already. Most people don't think about that till later. I think after a master's, you want 4+ years of professional experience. You want to know what you don't know. You come out of a master's program feeling pretty darn well educated, and you really want to hit the ground running. And I think until you're curious about something, if a doctorate were merely a collection of courses, anyone could do it, but it's not. You have got to be invested in your research topic because that's just you and that paper. And you've got to have enough motivation to get through that. There are lots of ABDs in the world.
Yeah.
They're not as many doctorates, and that's for a reason.
Yeah. No, I think you raise a good point. If early on, if you think, what I really want to be is I want to be a faculty member. I want to advance my research. You can probably go master's to PhD and just stay in the curricular world.
Yep.
But going back to this being, we say this is an applied field. The practice is so important, and I agree with you, Penny. I think I worry sometimes that practitioners will get a master's and they rush into the PhD. You really have to having that kind of base of experience in a variety of different student affairs functions. I think allows the PhD to be richer in a lot of ways, because it allows you then to apply some of what you've learned essentially in the workplace.
I agree. And the other thing is you can actually over-educate yourself relative to your experience.
Yeah, right.
And you think you know so much, you should get this kind of job. And people are like, well, you've never supervised anyone.
That's right.
So that can be a mismatch.
Yeah. All right, we will get, I promise you we're going to get off our sort of reminiscing about the old days. But I would like to just have you reflect a little bit on now as you think back on this really quite rich career. What are some of the key lessons that you have picked up along the way that you think would be helpful to share with the folks here?
Oh gosh. So I think the most important thing in order to do these jobs well is to have a significant dose of empathy and compassion. As challenging as the work is at the strategic level, and it is, if you don't fundamentally care about the well-being of other people, it's it'll be hard to stay motivated to do this work. And what happens is if you advance throughout your career, the scope of what you're doing changes, but that heart, I think, still needs to be there. I think the other most important thing I learned along the way is the importance of coalition building. Nobody does this work alone. Nobody tackles something like diversity and inclusion on their campus without all kinds of partnerships. So sometimes what student affairs has to bring to the table are actual engaged students, maybe some resources and whatnot, but we're often bridge builders between others on campus to tackle the biggest kinds of issues. So, one of the first things I did as an entry-level hall director was get together with some folks and propose an academic credit RA course. Well, I never could have done that by myself. That took a lot of different players, but that taught me that lesson about connecting with others quickly and putting that curriculum together. And I just learned that most of what we get done through coalitions and strategic partnerships.
Yeah. Which kind of, I think about, my own reflection on this question. And one's very practical, which I say to all young professionals, and that is, it's a big country, right? We have thousands of institutions. Lots of, thousands, even NASPA alone, NASPA has 15,000 members. There's probably, 45,000 people who work in this field, maybe nationally, which sounds like a lot of people. But you'd be amazed at how small it is. And so when I meet a young grad student or young professional, what I say to them is, I have not met you, but I know two or three people that know you. And that's just the nature of the work. It is very small. But I think that puts a high value on sort of ethical behavior in the field and doing the right thing, and being, sort of just acknowledging that you're in a very, small field in a lot of ways. And so what you do, what you say, how you say it matters. And doesn't mean that everybody has to be the same, but I think when it comes to sort of ethical behavior in particular, I think that's one thing. Second thing is just sort of an observation I have about where we're heading as a field. So no matter, if your first job's in Res Life or orientation or Greek life or wherever it is, wherever you start, whether it's an assistantship or whatever, you start building an expertise in that particular area, which is great. But I think as your career expands, you're going to have a choice between going really deep and vertical in one thing or being more of a generalist. And I am increasingly of the opinion that generalists are going to be highly valued in this field because of that cross-cutting work that you just kind of mentioned, the coalitions and the work across departments and working with academic affairs and sort of not being having one song, but having multiple songs. So I would suggest to you, for example, very practically, if you, for example, let's say you go to grad school and you're going to be a graduate residence hall director, great experience. Talk to your supervisor about opportunities to get on a committee or a commission or an activity that is outside of res life. Maybe something in student conduct or in multicultural affairs and equity and inclusion or whatever that might be. So thinking about that sort of broad-based experience, I think, is important.
I think that is, and I want to make another point about that, Kevin. Lots of the graduate preparation programs are at very large public universities. And so there'll be 10 people in an office devoted to orientation or to student activities or those kinds of things. On smaller campuses, you don't have that kind of specialization. You're not going to be able to advance within those specified roles. And so generalists are needed even on small campuses. You're gonna wear multiple hats typically.
And then again, many of you come to this in different ways. I think it also opens up this notion of what does a career in student affairs look like, and where would you end up? Because you may end up at a big place like Ohio State, but just look at NASPA, for example. 60% of our institutions, our member institutions, are institutions of 5,000 students or less, and so that really is that environment you talked about where you're playing multiple roles, multiple hats. And 2-year and 4-year colleges, 2-year and community colleges as well, which is a growing opportunity for student affairs professionals. And you oftentimes think of the classic residence hall experience, but increasingly the traditional student actually is more the minority than the non-traditional student in higher ed. So having experience with different types of students, I think, is probably another thing that you might think about building in your career as you move forward.
Joan Hurt wrote a great book called Where You Work Matters, and it breaks down the very difference in the nature of the work across different sectors of the higher ed world. It's a great read if you're really trying to think strategically about where you want to be.
Penny, when I talk to vice presidents, it's very common for people like yourself to say, people who've done this for a while, to say, the work that we do today is so qualitatively different than it was even 10 years ago or 5 years ago. We seem to be in a period of fairly high-level transformational change in terms of nature of our students, and really in some ways the nature of the issues that are elevated within student affairs. At least that's a perspective. So if and you're nodding, so can you give us some thoughts about where you have seen some of the most significant changes, either in your role or in the way in which student affairs is positioned at, in your previous institutions or currently?
It's such a great question, Kevin, and really allows me to sort of probe my own experiences. I mean, the first and most obvious change is just what technology has done for us, right? Technology has affected everything that we do now. I was talking with Larry Mineta from Duke the other week, and he has a data analytics person embedded in all of his key departments. And we're not staffed at that kind of level, but that's the future of the field,
didn't exist.
Right? No, it didn't even exist as a field, and so the future is beckoning. And then think about the role of social media. All of us know, for example, that you can't get out in front of a racial bias incident or a suicide on your campus because it's gone viral before you can even pull together what seems like a sound approach to communicating to your various constituencies. And parents tend to know things before we do even now. So technology is really a game changer. I also think the level of complexity of the challenges that we see has grown. Everyone talks about mental health particularly, and those of you know that just from your peer groups, that you have friends that are open about navigating changes and identity issues and depression, anxiety. So all of that is more complex. And then there's the whole issue of sort of mass tragedies. You think about something like the Virginia Tech shooting or the other kinds of mass tragedies, and the sophistication now of risk management approaches and whatnot. Those were not things that we learned in grad
Yeah,
school.
that's right.
You know,
Yeah,
it's become a very more complex world, I think, to deal with in general.
Mm-hmm.
Also, the rise of international education. Many of our campuses have significant numbers of folks who have completely different cultural backgrounds, or learning in a second or third or fourth language, and it's just very different.
Yeah, you know, I think about Joseph Ayoun, who's president of Northeastern University. He wrote a book called Robot Proof, which is really interesting. Well, it's a whole different subject for a different webinar, but it's this notion of how do you prepare students, college students, to graduate in a world that is increasingly influenced by artificial intelligence and robotics.
Right.
So how do you make robot proof? That's the point of the book. But one of the threads in his recommendations is this idea that all college graduates need something he calls cultural agility. And it makes me think of that. And I really like that word, cultural agility. But but I think you could extend that to student affairs work.
Yeah.
You know, we're working in incredibly diverse communities where we really are, in some cases, the touch point for people as they express their individual identities and they are challenged by the way the institution responds to their identities. And this notion of cultural agility, whether it be around international students, transgender students, or the wide range of religions, race, ethnicities, increasingly that has become a core part of our work, maybe in ways that wasn't 10 years ago.
Very true. We use the term cultural humility at Wake Forest with really the same intent to how you decenter the white, cisgender, heteronormative identities that have, you know, the media has sort of defined, and how do you decenter that so that those multiple voices can be heard, and the intersections among them. And I think when we both learned from Lee Kneffelkamp, who was one of the foremost theorists about identity, and the complexity of the identity journeys that we now understand are really different from when we were studying.
Well, you mentioned technology, and I think, you know, the folks who are in this webinar are largely probably digital natives, and so you will come with an acuity about that. And that's actually a really highly valued skill, I think, as we think about young professionals, to help us navigate that world of technology and social media. I would add a couple other things. You mentioned data, which in Larry Manetta's story about having a data scientist or a data analyst. Not every division can do that. However, I would suggest to those of you who have, you know, the kind of, you know, side of the brain that connects to analysis and mathematics, that we are going to need to grow the capacity within student affairs to do this kind of work. You'll hear the term assessment a lot, and assessment clearly is a critical skill set that you might want to uncover and explore in your early part of your career. But I would add to that now data science and data analytics and predictive analytics, which is really a different science than just the assessment work we've been doing. But increasingly now we are trying to, you know, across our institutions, drill down to the N of one. You know, what is it about what's happening with this student? What do we know is going to help the student be successful? And it takes a level of science around that to make sense of that. And student affairs has been a little slow on this, I think, to some degree. But this is an opportunity, I think, for those of you who have that skill set. The other one, and you mentioned the myriad of, you know, just take mental health issues as one aspect. There's a movement towards, you know, case management as another kind of methodology about how we work with students that sort of connects to student affairs, but in some ways maybe even have a slightly different preparation. But I think that's something, again, for us to think about. For those of you in the audience, you know, you certainly might pursue a master's in a classic higher ed or student affairs program. But I've been talking to young folks who are interested in it, who maybe are thinking about getting a social work degree. Well, a lot of campuses are hiring social workers. I don't know if you've done this yet, but
we hired our first case manager my first year in 2014, and we hired our second one this year. So this is someone that is really tracking individual students of concern, connecting them to resources. That's almost the definition of a social worker. And working with families and parents and external resources to support student success and student learning.
Let's just shift gears a little bit. if you all read as you're thinking about this field, and I would encourage you actually to get a free subscription to the Chronicle of Higher Education and Inside Higher Education. Those are our two major trade publications within higher ed. You can get like a little news aggregator every morning delivered to your email box, and you may not be reading, you might read it as less than Penny and I do, but it gives you a sense of some of the issues out there, and you just get a sense of the broader context of higher education. One of the things I think that is interesting is if you talk, there's a lot of competing narratives about higher education today. Some of them are not very positive. In fact, I just saw a Gallup just had a more recent poll that less than half of Americans have a positive feeling about higher education. So we have that kind of thing out there. Some of it's about the changes, it's the cost, affordability, those kinds of things.
The culture wars.
The culture wars. There's a lot going on campuses. I guess I'm for this younger audience, asking, are you as you think about all this, do you tend to be sort of optimistic about the future that they're entering in higher ed, or are you more on the pessimistic side?
It's a funny question. I think of myself as very much a pragmatist, but I also am an optimist. I'm just by nature a glass half full person, and so I try to maintain a positive outlook myself. I feel that's really essential, quite honestly, in my job. If I can't believe that our best days are still ahead of us as a culture, as a society, then I don't think I should be working influencing the lives of young people. I really don't. And when I think about that, for me, yes, we have real problems. Climate change is one that really is very worrisome because of sort of the finality of it. But along almost every measure, the world has continued to get better. It's continued to get healthier.
That's true.
It's continued to people live longer. It has, with fits and starts, it has continued towards equality, towards freedom, to citizenship. All those kinds of things are around the world continuing to grow. So even though I think we live in trying times, we live in threatening times. I do believe that our best days are still ahead of us.
I agree. I think your notion of optimism is spot on. I mean, if you're going to choose this field, I mean, you have to believe in the power of education, right? And what and how transformational that is. Having said,
Well, I also think that there's no better place to make sense of all this than a college or university campus. Yeah. I feel very lucky and privileged to have access to the kind of speakers, the kind of thinkers that I have access to, who are really, we're really looking at this polarization issue on our own campus. We're really digging into it. We're really trying to find people that can enlighten us. We're really trying strategies to bridge some of those divides so that perhaps our students can graduate into a less polarized world because of the values that they're carrying forward. So I still think these are trying times, and it's hard to work at a university. It's not a job, it's a vocation. You really have to be fully committed, but I still think it's the place to be.
Just an aside on because I know Wake's doing a lot of really good work in this area, and you don't have to look very far in the news to sort of see the dysfunction of some of our major institutions in our country, whether it be Congress or other kinds of areas, and so that kind of polarization, I think, is really kind of frightening in a lot of ways.
It is.
But I'm really looking at what universities and 2-year and 4-year institutions are doing across the country, trying to create opportunities for students to dialogue with each other around difference in a healthy way that we hope can change some of the tribalism and the kind of the polarization we're seeing in our politics. If we can't do it at the college level, then where can we do it? And it's just, which kind of opens up this sort of, if you watch the news, that the college universities, many right now, are sort of battlegrounds for really, very divergent thought and speech on critical issues that we care about as a society. And I think that's, so you're entering an environment now that really is, there's a little bit of a, kind of battle going on about, what can be said, who can say it, and in what way can it be said. I was really interested. I was interested in some comments that Jenna Napolitano made, who's the president of the University of California system, at a conference recently, and she was talking about free speech, and she said, "Well, free speech isn't free. It's not just the cost, but it's expensive to kind of actually execute." And then Teresa Sullivan, who was the previous president of the University of Virginia, she had talked about, just this challenge of doing what you're trying to do at Wake, which is to create these avenues, because you want to create opportunities for all speech to exist. But some of our members of our community, and maybe some of the folks here in this audience, are like, or should believe, you shouldn't have speech that that is not affirming of people's identity and their. And it's challenging. It
is challenging. So the way I think through that out loud on my own campus and with students, first of all, is that universities are fundamentally about the search for truth. And so there are lots of things that we believe is true at one time that later are disproven. And so that's just the reality, right? You're constantly uncovering more truth, and that's important. So that's the fundamental nature of a university. And so, all ideas can and should be examined, but those are ideas. What we can do is separate speech from behavior, right? Behavior that is personally directed at someone, that denies their humanity, could be seen as threatening, all those kinds of things. That's not speech. That's that's not the province of ideas. But the other question really is who decides, right? And so the broadest tolerance for freedom of expression really does allow sort of bad thoughts and bad ideas to just fall by the wayside. Richard Spencer's a pretty good example of that. Some of you may know Richard Spencer, a neo-Nazi or just a plain old Nazi, who was making really a mockery of college campuses, and it took universities a little while to figure out how to manage that, and he's just not on campuses anymore. A couple of brave institutions, I think Michigan State was maybe a turning point, took their First Amendment commitment to freedom of expression, had to host him. He'd had successful lawsuits against other places, and they just managed it using the tools of time, place, and manner in a way that deprived him of what he craves, which is the spotlight and all of that consternation that he creates.
Back to that pessimism, optimism question, I do want to raise a challenge that many of you will face as you come into higher education, and that is we are struggling with some equity issues in higher education, in particular around degree progress and degree completion for low-income students and for first-generation students and for some sectors, some races and ethnicities who are enrolled in higher education, and then the intersection of all three of those. For example, I was looking at a data point the other day that the lowest quartile of income, so the bottom quarter, and if we always believe as a country that you get in, you pull yourself by the bootstraps, which is kind of a mythology. But what's happening with the low is that the degree completion rate for low-income students hovers around 25%, as compared to the top quartile, which hovers around 60%. That gap is something I think we have to be concerned about. I'm not pessimistic, but I'm deeply concerned about how the pathways providing for low-income students, first-generation students, and students of color, and I think there's a lot of energy around that. I think those of you who are going to come into this field, you're going to hear a lot about student success as a key component of most universities' mission, and that gets wrapped around the sort of idea of how we support students who historically have not completed college at the same level that more privileged peers have. So I think that's something that we're going to see more of.
I think it's important, and I think you all should know that NASPA is doing some of the best research. They've got the funding from organizations like the Suter Foundation and Lumina and the Gates Foundation, big, prominent funding organizations to explore and find out, figure out what's working. So NASPA is a real leader in this, but it is a challenge. Sociologists know that most Americans die in the same social class they were born into, and that the structural inequities are deeply embedded. There are, of course, many, many individuals for whom that's not true, but structurally, it's pretty challenging. But I think you and I are both committed to higher education as one of the ways, for one of the processes for access and mobility.
Social mobility is a key component of what America's dream is, right? That that you can rise above the place that you were born, and that the birth lottery doesn't determine where you're going to be.
Right.
And higher education clearly is a way around that. Around that. One of the ways that you all will, and we do in this field, is that how does that happen? And the interactions that you will have with students is so empowering.
It's true.
It makes a huge difference. Penny and I we can reflect on our experience, and Penny, you have more recent campus experience of students, even students with whom you had challenging conversations, and they will come back after graduation and say, "You changed my life."
It's true.
So you're choosing a profession
that
you can have at the end of one, and certainly more than one, there's a tremendous impact on a person's life. Just believing in people and supporting them and listening to them and being there when they struggle. It's very, very powerful. So I hope that all of you in this call see that as something that will energize you, because that is a lot of the work, and there's a lot of technical parts of the work, but that one-to-one piece is huge, right?
It is, and it's interesting. Even a chance encounter, you can later find out, has been a turning point for someone that you may not have experienced it that way. But that is really powerful.
Yeah. Well,
and it is why we keep doing what we're doing.
That's why we keep doing what we're doing. Yeah. But then leads me to sort of the extension of that. So now for the young professionals who are going to enter the field, can you talk a little bit about about mentorship, connecting to others? What are some of the advice you might give this cohort about how to establish themselves in ways that they get the kind of support they need to advance their career?
Well, Kevin mentioned our mutual mentor, Jim Osteen, earlier, and Jim is a great example of someone. He was my first boss, my first job out at UNC Chapel Hill, and then later hired me to join Kevin and others on the campus activity staff. And I had dinner with Jim last night. I've known him since 1977. And so, some of these are lifelong relationships. You don't know that going into it. But when I think about the importance of a mentoring relationship, I realize that a mentoring relationship is something that you can't pick. You can't say, I want you to be my mentor. A mentoring relationship is a relationship that grows and flourishes. And it's a mutual relationship. It is, it's not the wise mentor fills the empty vessel. It is a mutual relationship. And so what I've also noticed, though, is there are lots of ways to have mentoring moments in your life that fall short of that, long-term relationship. And simply asking people for advice, simply job shadowing people, simply connecting with someone and saying, who else do you know that I might talk to about what you do? Those kinds of things can become mentoring moments that allow you to piece together different sources of perspective and wisdom for you. Some of them will lead to and become true mentorships, and that's a wonderful thing. I try to be a mentor. I try to be available for that. But that's something that another person has to want. They have to open themselves up. They're essentially about vulnerability, really on both sides. You can't have a real deep relationship without some mutual vulnerability. And, we're not always up for that. But,
this is a little bit of a place of controversy, I guess, or at least of some chafing, because I think that what you're suggesting is that a mentorship builds on a relationship. And I know that some people will call somebody, cold call them, and say, would you be my mentor? And it probably not going to happen that way. Having said that, I think they're also, and maybe we think about this sort of as the universe of relationships we have. I mean, you will have some deep mentors, and I think that's an important part of of you being part of this field. But networking doesn't necessarily. I mean, there's lots of different relationships you can kind of advance, and as a young person, I might come to you and I may not be looking for the kind of deep mentorship,
Right.
but I might be interested in some perspectives on an issue or
Yes.
hear about your background, that kind of thing, and just making those connections. I think if you do that in an authentic way, I think that is really valuable. I will say that there's a NASPA program that some of you may have heard of or be aware of. It's called the NASPA Undergraduate Fellows Program. It's a program that's been in existence for over 30 years, and it's specifically designed to provide some pathway entry points for historically marginalized communities within higher education who are interested in going into higher ed. Some of the NASPA staff and some of the faculty of that program really ingrain in these young professionals the networking piece.
Mm-hmm.
You know, you can see them at a conference. You know, you can go, like, you can go to a NASPA conference, 8,000 people. You could be so overwhelmed, even if you're an extrovert, that you just don't know what to do. But sometimes it means, like, you know, taking some risks and actually introducing yourself and trying to engage in some conversations and putting yourself out a little bit, which is different than mentorship.
Sure.
But it's that kind of
It
idea
leads to
that,
it.
yeah, it can lead to it. Yeah.
I mean, I think, you know, we have, at different moments in our career, we'll have, you know, sort of bedrock people that are there for us. We'll have someone who's a guide for us for a period of time, or a touchstone about our values. You know, there are different roles that people can play, and all of them can be meaningful, but you have to be open to it. I mean, I think fundamentally what you're talking about, Kevin, is a person who is open to that kind of, those kinds of experiences.
I'm going to ask one more question, and I think Colleen, we might have a couple of comments on the line here. But one of the things that's being debated or talked about a lot is, goes a little bit back to this sort of free speech piece, but it's bigger than that. The generation, if all of you in this call, many of you are kind of in the latter parts of your collegiate experience and getting ready for grad school, you are largely being now described as being part of Generation Z at this point, and maybe the very tail end of the millennials.
That's right.
And what we're observing about this generation, which is really exciting, is that this generation is much more activist and involved than previous, cohorts of generations. I mean, in a kind of an amusing way. I don't know if you ever thought this, but 10 years ago we were like, why are students not more engaged? And they got engaged about parking and food, right? And now, they're sitting in the president's office wanting to change structural, inequities in the campus and that kind of thing, which is great. But one of the things I think emerges from that is that is the difficult, challenging space between being an institutional representative. So you have you come in and you're a hall director, you're working in orientation or student activities, and your generation and maybe your own personal experience was coming out as an activist out of college. And how do you maneuver the space between your personal activism and your role as an institutional representative? This is a place that I think is we as a profession are struggling with right now, and you will be coming into some of that struggle. I'm curious about your thoughts on this.
It's an interesting issue. We certainly want people who work for us who care passionately about issues like equity and whatnot. So that's a good thing, to be motivated by the big thorny issues of the day. I think it's very tempting, particularly for new professionals, to want to align themselves with students and their causes. I think that makes perfect sense. Of course you do. But you really want to be part of the solution. That's part of your role as a professional. So you can I'd like you to realize that you have way more influence being at the table than outside with the sign. And this is now your opportunity to get a seat at the table. And so how can you use your position to gather important data, to amplify students' voices, to look, benchmark policies from other campuses? So do your work as a form of activism. And then take your activist spirit out into the community. Work on voter registration drives locally. Work on the poverty task force. Go ahead and protest against a candidate who you don't like. Those kinds of things as citizens you really need to do. So I would say try not to do that on your own campus, because you really separate yourself then from someone who can help shape the policy, right?
Yeah. It's a gray area. I'll just end with one anecdote of a colleague we know at a institution, a vice president of student affairs, who there was a major campus protest. They were calling for the resignation of this protest of the president and the vice president of student affairs. When this particular vice president went out to talk with the students on the steps of the president's house, they saw some of their own staff with signs up saying "Fire the vice president." That's probably not a good idea. In the gray area, maybe we can avoid that.
It is a potential career-ending decision. And there may be something. Bud Thomas, one of our other mentors, the guy who taught our capstone classes, he always said, you have to know what you're willing to go to the mat for. What are you willing to lose your job over? It's that important to you. If you don't know what that is, you can end up ethically compromised, right? So, everybody's got their no-go zone.
Yep.
Right?
Yeah. Which, we're not going to get into this now. Let's see if we can get some questions. But it makes me think also that that's much more complicated today than it was 10 years or 20 years ago.
Yeah, with social media.
With social media, because many of you have a social media identity, and then you'll have a professional identity, and how those two come together is not insignificant either. Because it doesn't mean your social media identity has to be aligned with the institution. But it's a very public thing, and so that this is what you tweet, what you say, what you post will sometimes be can be part of the way people interact with you at the institution. So it's complicated. So, well, good. We could do this for a while. Colleen, I see there are some questions. I want to make sure we don't leave out any questions. Can you tee up a couple of them for us?
Absolutely. So we've got one question from Ina here, who says, is there room to move into student services later in one's career with minimal background in student services as an undergrad? So minimal experience in undergrad. And what would help to make someone a stronger candidate? She has a master's degree in a different field that is related to student services, but is an additional master's degree necessary? Are there limitations if one doesn't get a traditional student affairs master's degree?
Great question. People find their way to NASPA who say, hey, I've been teaching, I've been an elementary school teacher, or I've had a career in something that's sort of in the human dignity teaching space, and can I get into student affairs? And the answer is yes, but it's not super smooth either. So first thing, I wouldn't necessarily recommend getting a second master's. I think you may look at some certifications or some professional development you could do that would expand your portfolio, so you could make sure you understand the language of student affairs. Getting a second master's, I don't know that that's really a high value. I mean, having the master's is important. But you're going to have to do the translation between your current, whatever you've been doing, and where you see yourself going in student affairs. That's going to be on you to do that. And you're probably going to have to find a place that is willing to think non-traditionally. Because there is a kind of a career track. College, get a master's in higher ed field, and be a hall driver. Whatever that is. That you're kind of interrupting that, and you're going to want to come back. You're going to want to enter maybe a step in some ways. So not easy. This is the place where informational interviews and really making connections so you can get past the limitations maybe your resume might have.
I would agree. Also, community colleges tend to hire actual practitioners. They don't want people straight out of a master's program. So that's a great place to look. And also, liberal arts colleges tend to they're not populated by people who went to the big state schools and those programs. So they tend to hire more flexibly people, who came out of that liberal arts mold. So those are a couple of things to look at. But you'll have to do a very personal search and not just send out a bunch of resumes.
Yeah, great. Colleen, what else? Colleen, any more questions from the group?
Yes, I'm so sorry. So we've got a question here from Amber. Amber asks, were there any challenges or difficulties faced when wanting to change or excel your career in higher ed?
One thing I would say, the issue of what some people call work-life balance, I just call balance, because work and life aren't two different things to me. But I would say for folks who want to really excel or expedite their career, you're probably talking about taking on a fair amount of ancillary assignments, the volunteer things that get you noticed by other people. Simply doing your job to the best of your ability will keep you in that job, actually. So, you know, sometimes and sometimes that work, whether it's volunteering for NASPA, getting known that way, presenting and writing, all those things take time. And so you have to sort of be committed to something beyond a traditional 40-hour work week.
Yeah, I would just add to that, and you kind of referenced it, this being intentional about building your professional brand, and your professional brand has a lot of components to it, but one of them is the way in which you have connected outside of even your own institution, which is why, you know, it doesn't have to be NASPA, you've happened to be talking to NASPA people here, but any professional association, I think early in your career, it's so important to get connected. First of all, you'll meet people who do similar things or have similar interests, but doing a presentation, writing a blog, writing a journal article, all those things are building your portfolio. That's how you can help accelerate your career a little bit. Because I'll tell you, you know, when you're looking at a job and you have 100 applications, you're looking for distinguishing features. Everybody has done the same thing. What else have you done outside of that? It's almost, you know, it's sort of, so that portfolio of things that you've done, and again, the great thing about social media today is that now it goes beyond just conference presentations. And literally, you can have a body of work in your own blog that can talk about the issues you care about or research you're reading, research that you're connected to. So I think that's another thing. But being intentional about that, and finding ways to demonstrate your commitment to the field and what you know, what you're passionate about.
Yeah, I think that's good advice.
Yeah. I think we have time for one small question. Have we got one, Colleen?
Yes, so we've got another question here. So Careers and Student Affairs Month often focuses heavily on undergraduate students, graduate students, and new professionals, but professional development in the field never stops. So what advice do you have for mid-level professionals to make the most out of their career?
Yeah, Kevin knows I'm a big fan of some of the more intentional institutes and programs that groups like NASPA organize. So there's a institute for AVPs. There's an institute for people who aspire to be senior student affairs officers. So there's
a mid-level institute.
Yeah, there are mid-level institutes, even new professional institutes. That's a great place to start. But those institutes offer deeper learning, more connected learning, create a cohort model of people that, you know, can become you know, part of your extended network. So I really like that approach to sort of digging in at a deeper level. I do think certifications are also useful, like an assessment certification right now is very valuable. Lots of us struggle with the knowledge it takes to accurately determine the difference a certain program is making. And that certification, there's certifications in emergency management, there's certifications in communications, and, you know, some of those kinds of things I think are useful.
Yeah, I think it's a great answer. Well, we're right at the end of this thing. I want to, first of all, Penny's, you know, we could just spend all day talking, which is lovely. I always enjoy our exchanges when it comes to things like this. Thank you all for your interest in being here. I hope that this has inspired you to join Student Affairs. It's the best profession.
It is. It is.
We both would say the same thing, that we feel honored to be a part of it. We love it. It's an incredibly rewarding work. It's incredibly rewarding work. So,
it is.
And it's
Should we invite them to follow us on Twitter?
I'm at NASPA Pres, and
I'm at WFU Rue, R-U-E.
Yep. And we talk about higher ed stuff and that kind of thing. And if any of you have any individual questions, you can find me and Penny on our websites, and please feel free to reach out, and hopefully get a chance to meet some of you at a future NASPA event. So thanks very much. Have a great day. Thanks.
Bye-bye.
But I thank you both so much for a wonderful presentation, and thank you all for attending. As a quick reminder before we end, we do have 3 more webinars this month for Careers and Student Affairs Month. Next Wednesday at 11 o'clock a.m. Eastern Time, we will be having a webinar from Betsbel Martinez and Amanda Garcia, 2 graduate students from the University of Southern California, on graduate students working in California community colleges. So we hope that you'll be able to join us then. Thank you both once again, Dr. Kruger and Dr. Rue, for a wonderful presentation today.
Great, thanks.